Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. This is Researching Your American Civil War Ancestors, and Joe Hardesty is going to be our presenter for today. I'm Charlie Taylor, one of the CE consultants at KDLA, so I'm going to be just facilitating this webinar and taking care of the chat and any technical issues that come up. I'll turn the microphone over to Joe here in just a second. A couple things to just remind you of. Please feel free to chat in questions to Joe. If there's anything that gets past him, I'll jump in and let him know there's a question, but please feel free to chat with him, ask him any questions as we go along. At the end of the webinar, we'll give you a chance to download his slides that you can save and refer to later. We also sent out in the email reminder that went out this morning, I sent out a handout as well as 2 articles that he recommended on this topic. So you might want to go back and look at those if you haven't had a chance to yet. Additionally, you're going to get another email from me, hopefully, probably not this afternoon, but hopefully tomorrow, that will contain a link to an online survey about this training. And we please ask that you take a second to fill those surveys out, because we do use them and look at them very closely and look at what your training needs are. Additionally, you're going to get a certificate of attendance for coming today. So I think that's everything I've got. It looks like the sound is good, so I'll mute my phone on this end, and Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Charlie. I'm hoping everyone hears me okay, and if you don't, now's a good time to tell us so Charlie could fix that. Again, my name is Joe Hardesty. I'm the Kentucky History and Genealogy Librarian here at Louisville Free Public Library, and I want to express my gratitude for Charlie and her education team for inviting me to spend this hour with you talking about researching your American Civil War ancestors. Now, as we know, that's a big topic, and we're not speaking just about our veterans' ancestors or necessarily those that were living here in Kentucky. So we may be discussing Civil War ancestors that were in Virginia or Wisconsin or Minnesota, all over the place. So just bear in mind that the resources that we'll be talking about will be used just about anywhere in the United States. So what we're going to be doing today is first discussing some basic dates and important facts that will be having an impact on all of our ancestors. And then we'll be discussing some resources that are commonly found in your library, as well as those found at the Kentucky Historical Society, the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives, and even the National Archives. And then, if time permits, we will be wrapping things up with an overview of some of the fundamentals that all of our researchers need to bear in mind, and we need to remind ourselves of. And so we'll do that. And then when we're done, we're done. We could all go back to our reference desks. So let's first talk about, oh, come on, where's that button? Here we go. First important date is May of 1861. Governor Beriah McGoffin declares Kentucky neutrality. Now, prior to May of 1861, a number of the southern states were instituting state conventions to secede from the Union, and there was a pressure for the northern southern states or the border states to do the same. But McGoffin and the state legislature of Kentucky decided, no, we're not going to host a state convention to secede. We'd rather stay neutral. We don't want to have a dog in this fight. So if you had fellows in Kentucky that wanted to join the South and fight for the Confederacy, they would have been directed to either Camps Boone, Donaldson, or Truesdale in Tennessee. Whereas if you had ancestors who wanted to fight for the North, then they were directed to Camps Clay in Ohio near Cincinnati, or Camp Holt near southern Indiana, or near Jeffersonville. So those guys, prior to May of 1861, would have had to leave the state in order to fight for either the North or the South. All that seemed to change just a few months later in September of 1861, when General Polk in northwestern Tennessee decided to occupy Columbus in Hickman County. Now, some would say there was a battle or a skirmish. I don't know if any shots were fired, but he definitely took control of that town. Now, that just sent a scare through a lot of Kentuckians, and as did in Washington, D.C., and Washington directed, it was General Grant, who was in the Missouri Territory, to come across the Mississippi and enter into Kentucky through Paducah, and so as to try to stop any advancement of any Confederate forces. So that was the tipping point, and from that point on, all bets were off. Confederate forces as well as federal forces entered Kentucky to recruit as many people as they could, and they did. And of course there were battles going on throughout the Eastern Theater. Now, by July of 1862, there were so many deaths, so much carnage, so much blood spilled, that the federal government realized then that they needed to offer a pension for those widows who were families that were made widowed, or soldiers that were terribly disfigured and wounded and disabled and unable to support their families. So the first pension law was created then in 1862. They realized then that this was not going to be a battle or a war that would end with just one or two battles. This was going to drag on for quite a while. And those pension laws changed too over time, which we'll see in a little bit. And as you see here, in 1912, Kentucky's General Assembly passed its first pension law to benefit Confederate veterans. So there was no federal benefit given to Confederate veterans, but states, if they wished to pass a law to fund and support Confederate veterans, they could, but that's a state issue. They estimated 3.5 million men fought in the Civil War. That's a tremendous number, and that estimate, I think, is a little high. I've heard scholars say that close to 2.1 million men fought for the Union, and about 700 to 800,000 fought for the Confederacy. So it's somewhere between 3 to 3.3 million men, I would say. 3.5, I think, is a little at the high end. But you can imagine that 3.5 million people directly fighting in that war, and how many fathers and brothers and sons, uncles were killed or imprisoned. And so this is a huge impact on American society. 600,000 estimated died in the war. 600,000. That's a tremendous loss. So that gives us a kind of a political, economic, and social overview of the impact of the Civil War on our ancestors. Now, before we talk about the book and microfilm resources that we'll consult, we should obviously ask our patrons whether or not you've checked your own attic lately. Now, there's a lot of photographs and family Bibles and records that are in our homes, in our attics, or in our basement, and the top shelf of our closet that we haven't looked at in a long, long time. So we may want to dig those back out and research them more closely. You'll see on the left an image of a family Bible with birth announcements and deaths. You know, you're going to find Bible records that go back to the Civil War era. There's no question of that. There's just no doubt about it. Now, other things that you can consult too, which more or less like a virtual attic, will be your own family trees that patrons have created and are saved on their computers. Like on Family Tree Maker, for example, there's a wonderful filtering feature that you can filter out for just men born after 1816, let's say, and before 1845. Usually those date ranges, 1820 to 1845, is the age in which most men would have registered or signed up for the military. So you could use the filtering software to locate your Civil War ancestors. Also, let's remember too that in the 1890 Veterans Census schedule, your ancestor may be there. And the 1890 Veterans Census would give the branch of the service and what regiment they served in. Look closely too on question number 30 of the 1910 Federal Census. That indicates whether or not your ancestor served in the Confederacy or the Union. And of course, look for headstones. If you found a headstone in a military cemetery, that would often give the regiment name. All those would be obvious clues as to who your ancestor was. Now let's suppose you have an ancestor and you want to see more information about them. This would be my first choice. This is a 4-volume set of the Adjutant General's report for Kentucky. Every state had an Adjutant General's report, and I would consult it first. That's my personal first choice resource to consult, and most libraries have it. I think it's also on Google Books that you can download a copy to your workstation. Here on page 837, we have, for example, an entry for Jacob Kilmore, who was a private in Company I of the 11th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry. Notice below that, his name in the red box, you'll see that there have been some men that were transferred to other units. Some that at the very bottom, you'll see they deserted. Now, just because your ancestor is marked under the deserted column doesn't indicate that the man was a coward. I would not go so far as to say that. In the Civil War era, a lot of people deserted because they had good reasons to. For example, crops in their fields that they needed to get home to and harvest in time. Or maybe they received a letter that said that their mother was ill and was about to die. Now, that would give me good reason to leave. Or perhaps the food just was terrible and I wanted to go to a different unit. Or, heck, just fight for the other side. So there was all kinds of reasons why people deserted. And you'll see, too, just above that, on the bottom right corner there is a number of men who died. And that's shown there in the Adjutant General's report. Now here's another good record that I would consult. You see called the Roll of Honor, published by the U.S. Quartermaster's Department. This is a 20-volume collection in print. It's bound into 7 book volumes, and it's also available to you on books.google.com. Now, volume 17 of this collection shows a number of men that have died and are buried in Union Civil War cemeteries throughout the state of Kentucky. And this gives, of course, the date of death, which may be the only proof that you're going to have especially since Kentucky's vital record law didn't start until 1852, and many records just weren't kept during the Civil War years. So this would be a valuable resource to consult. Another great resource is the compiled service records. Now these were created in 1890, in which at the War Department, employees of the War Department consulted muster rolls and company record books, hospital records and prison records, and compiled all these records together into one document and placed them in a jacket. Now this is the jacket cover for Jacob Kilmore that you saw right there. Notice though that Jacob Kilmore's last name is spelled differently. As we see here, it's Kilmer. So you'll definitely want to look by the regiment name and then very carefully scan those last names. Now, this is an interactive question that I'd like to put out to those of you that are in the room with me. If you have the microfilm copy of the Kentucky service record, compiled service records, just let us know. And so others could see too. If you have the microfilm of the compiled service records, let us know and give us your repository name too. We may have to refer someone closer to you. Also, the compiled service records are available through Fold 3. And some repositories in the state have access to that. So if you also have access to Fold 3, or a subscription to Fold 3, let us know that too. Now if you don't have a subscription to Fold 3, or you don't have the microfilm of the service records, and you don't want to drive all the way to Frankfurt to use their copies, then consider submitting Form NATF-86 to the National Archives. And if you were to simply Google NATF-86, you'll get to the form that you would use to download, fill out, and mail to the National Archives to get a copy of the service record. And that's true for anyone, what state they're in. I see a number of organizations have Fold 3. That's very good. But if you have microfilm, that's the next best thing. Now, we talked about Jacob Kilmore being discharged due to a disability, and this is his disability record. In the very top of that form, you'll see a brief biographical sketch of who he is and where he's come from, when he was born, his age, even a physical description of Jacob is there. And if we wanted to know why he was discharged, it mentions here that he was discharged because of his age. I'm already 56 years old, so I'm considered old, I guess, compared to Jacob here. He had chronic rheumatism in his back and in his hips, renders him totally unfit for military duty. Now, I thought it was rather interesting, too, that the officer included this last line, he had the rheumatism previous to enlistment. Now, I don't know why he felt important to say that, but that might have an impact on whether or not Jacob receives any kind of a disability pension. Bear in mind, though, again, the pension laws did change. And that even if you were just downright old, I mean, you're ancient old, and you had served in the service at any time, you could have eventually qualified for a pension. So he still could have done that. Now, let's not forget, too, that your own library catalog is a resource. So make sure you consult your own catalog. Here is an example of our library, in which I searched for Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and I limited the search to books referring to Kentucky. I could have typed in North Carolina or Virginia to see what's regarding those states, but I was just curious to see what we had about Kentucky in the Civil War, and we had 172 titles cataloged in our records. And all of these would be excellent to consider checking out and taking home and reading. I showed this screenshot at a genealogy class recently, and one of the participants said that their ancestor was a member at Camp Nelson, and that she was going to go right to that book and take it home. And I think this would be an excellent way to get a feel for what your ancestors were living with and encountering. Not only can you find these state histories, but you could even sometimes find regimental histories and diaries published and that were cataloged. Now, don't forget to search the catalogs at the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives. Your patron can search their catalog and see what they might have, as well as the Kentucky Historical Society at history.ky.gov, and of course the Filson Historical Society here in Louisville at filsonhistorical.org. Those are three excellent collections that may have more information and would be worth the drive to Frankfurt or Louisville to consult. And then, of course, there's good old Heritage Quest. I love Heritage Quest, especially since most of our patrons can access it from home. I'm assuming that all of you have Heritage Quest. I hope you do. There's a wealth of information there. Now, we already mentioned in the census area there that you could search for an 1890 veterans census, as well as your ancestor on the 1910. Remember, that's question number 30 on that 1910 census. What I want to share with you, though, is the two files at the very bottom of that page, the Percy Index and the U.S. serial set. Let's speak about that for just a moment. The Percy Archive is just marvelous. How many of you have used the Percy Archive before? It stands for Periodical Source Index, and it's just huge. It's a bibliographic database of millions of articles published in over 6,000 genealogy and local history publications throughout the world, really. Here is a search, for example, of Kentucky, obviously, but you could use that drop-down menu and highlight any other state of your choice. I'm typed in the keywords for Civil War, and the record type, I wanted to limit it to just military records. In this search, for example, I came up with over 2,300 records. Now that's a lot. That's a big record set. And ladies and gents, brothers and sisters, if you have a young child in a bathtub, unattended, now is not the time to browse through all 2,300 of these records. Don't do that. Go take the child out of the tub, turn the boiling spaghetti pot off the stove, and come back and do a refined search of your collection. It's easy to do once you click refined search. Then you could throw in a county name that might limit it down further. Or maybe you want to search for Civil War cemetery records. Or you could type in a regiment name if you know that. So you could play around with those settings very easily by clicking Refine Search. One of the examples of a magazine that's indexed in Percy is the Confederate Veteran magazine, first published in January of 1893. And this is a marvelous example that will include things like recollections of battles and some biographical sketches. There's even ads for reunions of veterans, and even advertisements for and elixirs for baldness and rheumatism. So it's basically a newsletter to keep Confederate veterans informed with what's happening and who died and who moved. And so look for that in your collection. Now the U.S. serial set is something, I bet a lot of people don't use this. It doesn't scream at you to say, use me. But in fact, I do have genealogical value. So remember to consider using the U.S. serial set. You'll see that it's search for information about people and places in memorials, petitions, and private relief actions that were filed by Congress. So in a sense, for example, a veteran that had a pension, but then the pension benefit was reduced by a couple of dollars a month, or it was cut out completely. Well, what do you do in a case like that? Well, there needs to be some remedy if you still needed that pension. And in this case, Lucy Jameson petitioned Congress for a war claim. And this is a sample of what you get. She filed her war claim through her congressman, and you'll see that Lucy Jameson, the petitioner, was a resident of Memphis, Tennessee, and she was the widow of David Jameson, deceased. And it goes on to say that he was the owner of a 4-story brick storehouse in Memphis, and she was needing some form of relief. Perhaps the federal forces that occupied the storehouse just cleaned her out completely. Or maybe they paid her rent, but over time they stopped paying her rent. There are several pages to this war claim, but she felt need to file that. A question was asked, is the U.S. serial set and the Percy Archive only available through Heritage Quest? And to my knowledge, the answer is yes. I don't believe Percy is available through Ancestry, and I don't believe it's available anywhere else. And thank you for that question too, by the way. Now, another great resource, of course, is Ancestry. And we have the library edition, and many of you do too as well. So an easy way to search for that, for your ancestors there, is to click on the search military collection. And not only can you search for World War I and records and other war records, but there's a data file for U.S. Civil War soldiers, 1861 to 1865, and it's obvious. Click on that, and once you do, you can search for pension records. That's where you'll find an index, a complete index of those that receive pensions. Now, a couple of things about pensions. As mentioned earlier, pension laws changed greatly over time. And as they changed over time, they became more liberal. So at one point, you had to have an amputated arm or a leg to receive a pension. And then as time went on, they realized, well, maybe if you just have a couple of fingers missing, you still could qualify for a pension. And then eventually, even if you were just plain old, and you would qualify for a pension, as did eventually Confederates on the state level. So just bear in mind that even though your veteran may not have received a pension immediately after the war, he may have received one several years later. Now, what would be typically found in a pension file? You'd often find the Adjutant General's statement of service. In addition, you may also find medical information about the soldier if he lived some years after the war, and as well as affidavits attesting to the date or place of birth of the veteran, as well as names of his parents, names of his spouse, and perhaps even his children. A widow's pension may even have more, since a widow would also have to provide proof of marriage, such as a marriage bond or an affidavit from a local official or the minister who performed the marriage ceremony. And there were pensions awarded to minors of veterans. Not many, but there were some. And in case of an application on behalf of a soldier's minor child or children, they would have had to supply both proof of the soldier's marriage and proof of relationship to that soldier. So there was a tremendous amount of documentation that widows and minors had to provide in order to get a widow's pension. Bear in mind that you'll want to download and print off Form NATF-85 for a pension benefit, to receive a pension or to receive a pension application. That's NATF.85, and you can Google that and print that off. Now, if you wanted an exhaustive discussion on the Civil War pension laws and how they changed over time, you could go to this website. I believe it's on your handout, or simply Google Dr. Bronson and Civil War pensions, and you'll get to that page fairly easily. There's entire lectures just on pension laws, and if you need help falling asleep at night, you may want to tune into that. This is an example of a pension card for Enoch Abel of Company H for 10th Infantry, and it includes his application numbers for he and his widow. Now, strictly speaking, the application numbers are not required in order to submit an NATF 85 to the National Archives, but it's helpful if you happen to have that application number. I did even advise my patrons to print off that card and staple it to the application. That might help expedite a little bit on their end. Another great tool for us to consult is Worldcat. Now, many of us librarians have heard of Worldcat, and we can instruct our patrons how to access it remotely from home. In this sample search, I've typed in American Civil War as a subject, personal narratives as a keyword, and Kentucky as a keyword. And again, I could fiddle fart with those settings any way I want to type in a different location and do a search. And here, this is a result of that previous search. Now, my ancestor may not have had a diary that I found, But if I can find a diary of a fellow soldier that served in that same unit, I would want to read it. It might mention my ancestor in his diary, and certainly would give a wonderful real-world description of what life would have been like for my ancestor. Even if that's not his diary, I would still be wanting to research it. So remember Worldcat. And like I forgot to mention, if this item was not in your collection, then remember there's always interlibrary loan. Most of you have interlibrary loan service. Remember to suggest that to our patrons. Why drive 4 hours to the nearest library to look for this magazine article or this book when we could submit an ILL request? Amen? Don't you agree? Let's try to make life easier for our patrons. And here's another great source that I just love. The National Park Service came up with this site called the Soldiers and Sailors Database. If you were to simply Google that, you'll find it. Civil War Soldiers and Sailors Database. And there's more to the screen than you see here. If you scroll down, you'd see that you could also search cemeteries and battles, prison records, and other monuments. By clicking on soldiers, you could type in your ancestor's name, and it would give a list of his fellow soldiers in his regiment. It would also give a history of the regiment and what battles they fought in, which I think is cool. If you had a brief regimental history, then you could pull out an atlas of the Civil War and literally follow your finger and trace where your ancestor traveled, probably hiking all that way. We mentioned earlier that Kentucky passed a pension record law for its Confederate veterans in 1912, and by going to kdla.ky.gov and clicking on their e-archives page, you can search for Confederate veteran records that are been digitized and made available to you. So that's a great resource. I want to give a big shout out to KDLA. They've been most helpful to us. This is another terrific website, militaryindexes.com. Now, if you put in /Civil War, you'll get straight to their page. And this is just huge. You can see on the right that the slide bar goes down quite a bit. And these are just pertaining to Civil War sites. You could spend hours traveling through this web page. Now, just bear in mind, though, that some of these links would require a fee, and I try to avoid that whenever I can. But you know, if you're drilling down far enough, and all of a sudden you're taken to fold 3, well, don't give up hope just yet. Remind your patrons that there's often like a 3-week free trial offer floating around out there. And if you can get a free trial at a fee site, then take that and hammer it to death. Just don't allow your credit card to be charged if you can help it, unless you really like that website. So remember militaryindexes.com/Civil War. Has anyone used that before, or created a link on your website yet? You might want to consider that. And these are some other great websites. This two are in your handout. The Grand Army of the Republic, and the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, Sons of Union Veterans, and United Daughters of the Confederacy. All of these are terrific websites. You'll want to go there and explore them thoroughly. Many of these lineage societies have libraries of their own that you can contact for additional research assistance, and some will have online searchable databases that can perhaps give you more clues about your ancestors. So those are just a few of the big ones that I'm aware of. So now let's be wrapping up, and let's talk about some of the fundamentals that we all have to keep in mind. The first, I have to remind ourselves and our patrons to fully cite your sources. The name of the newspaper that you found your obituary isn't enough. What was the date of that obituary? What section did it come in? Fully cite that source. I need the will book and the page number of your county, and in which county did that will come out of. So fully cite that source. Now be exhaustive too. Leave no stone unturned. And for the last 30 or 40 minutes, we've shared with you a couple of other resources that you can put in your genealogy toolbox. And so you're going to have to search those too. So just because your ancestor didn't answer question 30 on the 1910 census doesn't mean that he didn't serve. He may have. So check numerous sources. Now, of course, be critical of the information that you consult. Don't believe everything you see. And just like if I read in the Adage and General's report how Kilmore was spelled, I would have missed him in the compiled service records. So just bear in mind that you'll want to consult every record to confirm the information. I often fail to do this myself, but having a research plan can save your patron a lot of headache. What is it exactly that you want to achieve when you drive all the way to Frankfurt and spend the day at the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives? Spell it out. Write it down on a piece of paper, exactly what is it that you want to get at that collection. And in addition, I would add, go to their website and get a good feel for what's in their collection before you drive all the way there. Amen? I mean, let's just, come on, it's common sense. It's a good idea to have a plan of what is it that you want to get when you get to that research repository. I also suggest to patrons to become and be an active member in a genealogical, historical, and lineage society. And there's lots of good ones out there. They're all good. And it's not just the Civil War lineage societies, but even all of them, just every one of them. And the Historical Society, not just in Kentucky, but if your ancestor was originally from Maryland or Atlanta or Alabama, become a member of their historical societies as well. Now, eventually you're going to hit a brick wall, and they always do. That's when you need to think outside the box. And so if your ancestor was found, let's say, in a 1850 census, but they weren't there in the 1860, then see if perhaps the county boundary changed. That's very possible. They didn't move. The county boundary lines did. They're just needing to look for that name in a different county. Or if they're in the 1860 census, but they're not there in the 1870, well, maybe they enlisted in the Civil War. They mustered in Camp Nelson in Kentucky, but they were mustered out in Memphis, Tennessee. And perhaps they just decided to stay there in Tennessee. So maybe we need to look in a different state. So as you revisit your most known ancestor and pour over the documents in the previous generation and look for additional clues as to where I could get around that brick wall. And finally, I suggest to my folks to be nice to librarians. You know, we work hard to maintain an excellent collection, to preserve it for future generations, and we bend over backwards to assist them. And so I tell them, you know, if you're going to contact the librarian in Frankfurt, be nice. You know, be patient to them, be polite, be considerate, be patient, you know, and you'll get more honey that way. And I'm that way too. I like to contact my colleagues out in the field. I sometimes get stumped for my patron, and I'm looking for a magazine article that's not in my collection. I'll call a librarian elsewhere, and I'll get on my knees. And with all humility, hat in hand, I'll ask, will you please scan and send me this article? My patron will be so grateful. I think it's also important that we librarians do as much collaboration as we can. You know, so reach out to fellow librarians in neighboring counties and offer to do workshops and attend workshops and learn about each other's collections as much as you possibly can. And that's the way we give good service to our customers. So this is a great time now to answer any questions you had. I was paying more attention to the PowerPoint, and I may have skipped over some of the questions, so now's a great time to fire them at me. We got a few minutes.
And Joe, I'm just going to hop on here real quick. This is Charlie. While people are typing in questions, please go ahead and chat those in. I'm going to change over to, this will give you, Kathy, this will answer your question. You can download these slides now. So the instructions on how to do that are there on the left-hand side of the screen, and the download box where you would get your copy of the slides is, whoops, I just made it disappear. I'm sorry. Hold on a second. My apologies. Let me bring it back. I clicked the wrong button. There it is. It's that box at the bottom of the screen. So if you click that little download box, it will click the name of the presentation inside the download box, and then click the download file button beneath it, and you can save it to your computer that way. So, and I just wanted to highlight that we have Joe's contact information here too if a question comes up that pops into your head once the webinar is over. So please go ahead and add any questions that you have for Joe now, though.
Charlie, am I still muted?
Nope, you're live. Go right ahead.
Okay, cool. Well, this is kind of a first for me, and I like seeing people interacting and dialoguing with me, and so I apologize if I come across a little nervous. I'm sorry about that. If you enjoyed my presentation, I hope you will fill out that survey. If you didn't like me at all and thought that my presentation was rotten and just throw a virtual rotten apple at me, you could do that too. I won't feel too offended. But I would like to hear from you, and if you have any questions, just shoot them at me. I'll see what I can do for you.
I can't imagine anybody wanting to throw a tomato at you. That's terrible. It doesn't look like any questions are coming in. So if
Well, let me throw one out to anyone else that's here. Has any one of you used the U.S. serial set before? In all of my lectures, nobody has ever heard of or used the U.S. serial set. Yeah, the U.S. serial set is a massive collection, but you know it's somewhat a little difficult to navigate, but not impossible. It's one of those resources you just have to consult to make sure you didn't leave something undone. So there's a couple of you that say you had fold 3. That's good. I like to be able to refer people to other institutions if it's near them. Well, guys, it's wonderful. I'm thanking you for joining me. I have other workshops that I've done in the past, and I could reach into my bag of tricks anytime that you or Charlie want to have me back. So I guess that's it, right, Charlie?
that is it. If nobody has any questions and Joe's all finished up, you can just click the X in the top right-hand corner of the screen when you're ready to exit. And as I said, I will send out a follow-up email that will have a survey that Joe mentioned. We do encourage you to fill those out and let us know if you liked it, didn't like it, you want to see more things like this, other genealogy-related topics as well. And you'll also be getting a certificate for attending today. And I also just wanted to draw your attention to our contact information at KDLA there on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. You've got the certification email address that we use for the CE contact information, CE staff, the services that we provide to libraries, and also our Twitter account that we use to promote trainings and other services that we're providing to specifically to library staff, children's services, E-rate, things like that. So check that out as well. So, but if you're ready to exit, you can just click that X in the top right-hand corner of the screen, and we thank everybody for attending today, and especially thank Joe for presenting today and sharing his knowledge and his expertise with us. So, Joe, it was a pleasure, and I'm not going to throw any tomatoes at you. I give you 2 thumbs up.
Oh, good, good. I have enough tomatoes already. I'll see you guys, I hope, next summer at Louisville Free Public Library's Genealogy Day. Take care, everyone.
Yes, thank you, Joe. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.